Howdy, my name is Nonat, and welcome to a brand new installment of Advanced Archetypes. Before we get going today, I want to take some time to say a few things. First off, I've moved. You'll notice that I'm using my old microphone right now, and that's actually because the room I'm in right now is incredibly echoey. I'm sure you can still hear it on this microphone, but unfortunately my Blue Yeti has such decent quality that it actually picks up way more echo than this microphone does. It may sound bad with this mic, but trust me, with the Blue Yeti, it picks up every single echo. Luckily, this microphone has sort of a lower gain, so it doesn't pick up quite as much. So apologies, but this is the microphone quality we'll be using for the next few videos until I can finagle a better setup. Thank you for understanding. Today, like always, we'll be covering 6 more of the new archetypes from the Pathfinder 2e Advanced Player's Guide. So let's not waste any more time and jump into the first one, which is the Dual Weapon Warrior. Starting off, the dedication is super simple. You get the Double Slice Fighter feat. It's a really solid feat for 2 actions. You make 2 attacks at the same multiple attack penalty, but you do have to be wielding 2 different one-handed weapons, one in each hand, and if the second attack isn't agile, it is still at -2. But as long as your second weapon is agile, that is 2 attacks at the same multiple attack penalty, which, if you haven't attacked yet, is normal -0. So that's really, really good, really efficient, just useless for fighters. Fighters who take this dedication literally get nothing since they already could take the Double Slice feat. But moving on to Dual Thrower, which is unique to the Dual Weapon Warrior, and pretty cool. You can apply any Dual Weapon Warrior feats that usually only apply to melee weapons, and apply them to thrown weapons and one-handed ranged weapons, which to my knowledge is just the sling and the hand crossbow. But this is really cool, because any feat you take, even if it's originally like a fighter feat, still counts as a Dual Weapon Warrior feat. So that Double Slice you get from the dedication, you can now apply to ranged weapons with this feat. So if you have 2 hand crossbows, you can now double slice and fire them both off. Granted, they're not agile, so one of them will be at -2, but still not bad. A -0 and a -2 with a hand crossbow? That's amazing. And that leads super well into the other feat, Dual Weapon Reload, which past Nonat got completely wrong. I stupidly thought you could reload both one-handed weapons at the same time. This is just the reload action, but you can do it even when you're dual wielding. So if you're wielding 2 hand crossbows, you can still reload one of them at a time, but you don't need to put either of them away. That's all it does. Moving on. Now the next feat isn't available until 8th level, but in my opinion it is probably the best feat the Dual Weapon Warrior has to offer. Flensing Slice. How this works is that if your previous action was to use Double Slice, and both hits on Double Slice connect, then you can spend your third action to just automatically inflict all of these debuffs. There's no saving throw or anything. As long as both hits of Double Slice connect, you can inflict 1d8 persistent bleed damage per weapon damage die you have. So if you have a striking weapon, that's 2d8 persistent bleed damage. And then on top of that, you inflict flat-footed and reduce its physical damage resistance to all physical damage, that's slashing, bludgeoning, and piercing, by 5. Granted, it's level 8, so 5 isn't a whole lot, and these effects do only last until the beginning of your next turn. So while these aren't amazing for you, the amount of bonuses this gives your team is incredible. If you have a rogue on your team, and you manage to land this flensing strike, they're bleeding, they're flat-footed, so that means your rogue is getting sneak attacks, and their damage resistance is reduced by 5. Oh, that's way worse. You know what, I'm gonna leave this whole part in, because I feel like my reaction is very similar to what a lot of people had with this ability. This ability is instantly far less good than I originally thought. Because the thing about Pathfinder 2e is that resistances and weaknesses are different things. You can't have a negative resistance. You can have a weakness, But what this means is you are reducing its resistances by 5, not inflicting a weakness to physical damage. This immediately makes it so much worse. It's still great if you're fighting something that's resistant to bludgeoning, slashing, or piercing, but I was under the impression originally that this would increase all damage against the target by 5. I don't think that's how this works. This just got a whole lot worse. The flat-footed is still good, and the bleed damage is still good, and it's honestly still not bad, because it's a confirmed additional bleed damage if you landed your double slice. Both hits on double slice. So it's a little hard to set up, but if you have a high enough to hit bonus, then this isn't too bad. But it definitely just lost some points because I was under the impression that it increased all damage they took from physical sources by 5. That is not the case. It only reduces their resistance if they have any. Moving on to Dual Weapon Blitz, which is a really good feat, albeit level 10 seems like a long time to wait for it. It is your typical martial 2 actions to do 3 things. In this case, it's stride once and attack twice for 2 actions. Now the cool part of this one that sets it apart from a lot of the other ones is that you don't need to stop where you attack. A lot of these ones are, like stride twice and attack, but stop wherever you decide to attack. Whereas this one, you can run through groups of enemies, make your attacks, and still end, 25, 30 feet away. Pretty good. Additionally, these strikes don't need to be against the same target. If you've got 2 low health enemies, you can run between them, attack each of them once. Good news, there you hit them both. Downside is that it doesn't say they use the same multiple attack penalty, so your second strike will still be at the -5 or -4, whatever you have. So it's really good. It has a lot of versatility. Again, I feel like level 10 is a long time to wait for this, but maybe with everything else they've given, it'd be there's no good place for it to fit. I feel like level 6 wouldn't be super overpowered for this, Maybe. I don't know. And Dual Onslaught at level 14 is sort of the penultimate goal of this build, aside from some of the late game additional feats that I don't cover in these videos. But Dual Onslaught allows, if you use double slice and both attacks miss, you still hit with one of them. So it's kind of a cool backup. You can see these last few abilities are sort of built around double slice, which again really kind of gets weird if you take dual thrower, because that means something like Flensing Strike can work with a ranged weapon, or Dual Onslaught. If you miss with both of your crossbows, you still hit the target. So my final thoughts on this archetype are very mixed. It's got some great stuff going for it, Any class that doesn't already get these kind of benefits for dual wielding, it's amazing for. Rogues and War Priest clerics can do some cool stuff here. But a lot of classes do already get stuff like that. Something like a fighter and a ranger get way better stuff from their basic primary class feats. As well, the monk already gets Flurry of Blows, which is effectively just better than Double Slice. It still inflicts the multiple attack penalty, but Flurry of Blows is 1 action to attack twice, which is absolutely nutty. I think there are some builds here that could be fun, but they're for very specific characters, and overall, I guess I was kind of hoping the Dual Weapon Warrior would have more to offer to the classes that already had dual weapon features, but could do some more with it. But really, the only unique things it offers are Flensing Slice and Dual Weapon Blitz, which, with what fighters and barbarians and stuff already have access to, is just not worth the investment. Dual Thrower and Dual Weapon Reload are still really cool, though. The ability to have a viable dual hand crossbow build is awesome. Moving on to the Duelist, and starting off with the Dedication, which requires you to be trained in light armor and simple weapons. Pretty easy. Everyone is trained with simple weapons, and you can always just take the Armor Proficiency General feat at 3rd level. Now, all you get from the Dedication is Quick Draw, the Ranger feat, and it's amazing. I will always stand by this as one of the best early game feats you could possibly get on a character, especially a martial class. For 1 action, being able to draw your weapon and attack is great. I don't care what kind of martial class you are, except for maybe a unarmed monk, but being able to draw a weapon and strike is huge. So many times I see people lose actions because they get ambushed and they have to spend an action drawing their weapon, and this just saves you an action. Effectively, this is +1 action in almost every combat that you weren't prepared for. Really good stuff. Now, Duelist's challenge is interesting. For 1 action, similar to the Ranger's Hunt Prey, you challenge a target. You challenge a creature to a duel. And from then on, you get a bonus to all damage you deal to that target equal to the number of damage dice you have. So if you have a striking weapon, every time you hit them, you're now dealing 2 extra damage on every attack. Not bad. The downside is that if you attack anything other than your challenger, you take a penalty to damage of the same amount. So if you have a striking weapon and you challenge one guy and then you attack another, you're dealing 2 less damage. You take a penalty to your damage because you didn't attack your challenger. I don't really get that myself. I'm not a big fan. I like the original idea. I like, just the very, very minor damage boost. Cool. Why prohibit them from striking anyone else? I guess it's an honor thing. I think a penalty to hit would have been better than a penalty to damage, because a penalty to damage doesn't really make a lot of sense, You're choosing to attack this guy. Why are you not hitting them as hard? I don't know. I also forgot to mention that the bonus damage only works if you are using a one-handed melee weapon with a completely empty other hand. Otherwise, you do not get the bonus. But you still get the penalty. Selfless Parry at level 8 actually requires you to take the Dueling Parry feat, which is one of the additional feats that the Duelist gains access to. And Dueling Parry basically means as long as you have a one-handed melee weapon and a free hand, you spend an action and you get +2 armor class for 1 round. Pretty decent. Basically like raising a shield. Selfless Parry makes that feat incredible, because you also now grant +1 armor class to all adjacent allies. And if you have the Dueling Riposte feat, which is if a character critically misses you, you can make an attack of opportunity, that now extends to your allies. As long as you are using Dueling Parry, if your allies are critically missed while adjacent to you, you get to make an attack of opportunity on the target that missed them. Really good. This, in my opinion, is the single best feat that the Duelist can take. Really, really solid stuff. Just improving on feats that already exist is a lot of fun, it's cool, and it's a great way to play a character. The final feat at level 12, and one that I kind of had a lot of problems with, is Student of the Dueling Arts. During your daily preparations, you can trade out any Duelist feat that you've learned for any other Duelist feat that you qualify for. So if you have Selfless Parry, you could trade that out for Dueling Dance or something like that. So that's a really cool thought, like really good flexibility. You can change it up depending on if you want to be more offensive or defensive that day. It's neat. Until you realize that it's super limited. First off, you cannot trade your dedication or the Student of the Dueling Arts feats. You cannot trade those out. Those have to stay. Okay, so you have to pick something else. So maybe then at this point, if you have 3 feats in this archetype, that means you can trade out 1 feat per day. Maybe 2 if you've put 4 feats into this archetype. The big benefit to this feat is that you can enter any Duelist archetype stance, even if you didn't learn it. However, entering the stance takes 2 actions instead of the normal 1. So it's a good feat in that it gives you access to a lot of different stuff, but it's a really restrictive feat in that 2 of the feats you invested in the archetype can't be traded away like this. Excuse me. My final thoughts on the Duelist is just, it's a really cool concept. I love the idea they're going for. It just falls a little flat. The amount of feats you have to invest in this for Student of the Dueling Arts to be worth it is about 4 or 5, and that's out of 10 total class feats you get from levels 2 to 20. So you're spending half of your class feats on Duelist feats, and the reward just isn't that great. Duelist Challenge is a great concept, but maxing out at +4 damage on a greater striking weapon, major striking, whichever one's higher, that just doesn't seem like a good enough reward to me. Some of the stances are great, and Selfless Parry combined with all the other feats is really, really strong and defensive. I just feel like the Duelist ends up feeling much more of a defensive archetype than I expected, and maybe that's intentional. Maybe dueling is a much more defensive fighting style than I think it is, but I guess it's just not quite what I expected. Maybe I don't know what I expected, but I feel like my main concern is that it would be much easier to make a fighter and then pick a different archetype than to make another class and archetype into Duelist, because Fighter gets most of the feats here automatically in their class. In fact, all of the additional feats the Duelist gets are from the Fighter class. I don't know, I'm definitely rambling on about the Duelist a little bit. I think I'm just a little disappointed. Let me know what you think in the comments. Moving on! Alright, Eldritch Archer, dedication gives you so much. Let's see. You have to be at least 6th level to take it, so I think it's the highest level archetype dedication we've seen so far, and you have to be an expert with some type of bow weapon. If you can already cast spells, you gain an additional cantrip from your tradition. But if you can't already cast spells, you choose one cantrip from one chosen tradition, and your spellcasting modifier for that tradition is Charisma. Also, this cantrip must have a spell attack roll in its effect. On top of this, you receive the Eldritch Archer's big whole gimmick right in the dedication. You get the Eldritch Shot 3-action activity. For 3 actions, you imbue a 1 or 2 action spell into your arrow and make a strike with your bow. You then make an attack roll using your bow, and that attack roll counts for both the bow strike and the spell imbued. So if you use this activity and imbue your arrow with Ray of Frost, you will make your attack roll. So if you're level 6, you will attack with your bow. Let's just say it's a regular bow for 1d8 and for 3d4 plus your charisma modifier from Ray of Frost. The 2 attacks are still considered separate, but they do occur at the same time. So in the example I gave before, they would take 1d8 piercing from the bow, as well as 3d4 plus charisma cold damage from Ray of Frost. Basic Eldritch Archer spellcasting functions the same as any other basic spellcasting benefit archetype feat. You gain spell slots and extra spells according to your level when you take the feat, as well as when you level up after taking the feat. If you're not quite aware of how spellcasting benefits work from spellcasting archetypes, may I point you to the top right corner where there is a video where I go over all the details of archetypes, including spellcasting archetypes and how they work, because I will be glancing over them in this video. Enchanting Arrow at level 8 is where this archetype really starts to get cool. It's a 2-action activity that makes a strike with your bow. Plain and simple, if you hit with that strike, you deal an extra 2d6 mental damage. In some ways, this is just like making an additional attack alongside your original bow strike for no extra multiple attack penalty. But on top of that, if you critical with that strike, not only do you double all of that damage, so let's say you're using a +1 striking bow, you're dealing 4d8 plus 4d6 mental damage, but on top of that, they're also stunned 1. There is no saving throw against this, by the way. If you critically hit with that strike, they're just stunned 1 and they lose an action on their next turn. And once you get greater or major striking runes on your bow, the mental damage goes up too. This is phenomenal and will almost always be your fallback for if you don't have any cool spells to put into your arrows right then, and you can just use Enchanting Arrow. I'll be honest though, I don't know exactly how enchanting this arrow is. Enchanted Arrow, I feel like would make more sense. Now Magic Arrow, also at level 8, is so cool, and one of my favorite parts of this archetype that I didn't expect to see. Once per round, as a free action, you imbue a bolt with the effects of any level 4 or lower magical ammunition. With Magic Arrow, you can now imbue Viper Arrow into whatever ammunition you're about to shoot, and when you fire it, it summons a Viper next to a target. And you can do this every single round. Granted, the Viper's level -1. It has a +8 to hit, and at level 8, probably isn't going to be doing much. But the Viper lasts 1 minute or until it's killed, and you can do this every round. So if you just keep firing magic Viper arrows, there's just gonna be vipers all over the ground. It is the closest thing we can get to sticks to snakes from old school D&D. Also, the effects of the ammunition are not bound to the ammunition type, such as the climbing bolt can only be used in the crossbow, but you can take the effect of the climbing bolt and put it on, say, a bow and arrow. Precious Arrow for 1 action is super simple. You spend an action, and then when you shoot that piece of ammunition that turn, it functions as either cold iron or silver. So you can use this to hurt specific things with specific weaknesses. And then at level 14, you automatically gain the ability to treat your arrows as if they were adamantine. Really cool stuff. Expert Eldritch Archer spellcasting. Try saying that 5 times fast. Same as basic, it gets you more spell slots and more spells. Seeker Arrow at level 14 is a 1-action strike that, as long as you can see the target, if they are behind cover or concealed, you can now ignore both of those conditions and strike normally. So you can ignore the AC bonus from cover, and you don't have to roll because they're concealed. It's worth mentioning this is a specific type of strike, so you can't combine this with, say, Enchanting Arrow or Eldritch Shot, since these are all specific strike actions. Phase Arrow. Once per day, for 1 action, your shot ignores walls, ignores non-magical barriers, ignores armor, ignores shields. It cannot be stopped by any non-magical means. And if your target is wearing non-magical armor, you get a +4 bonus to hit them. This also ignores concealed, hidden, and any armor class from raising a shield. This is fantastic. Honestly, this is very similar to Seeker Arrow, just way better. The only downside is this is once per day, while Seeker Arrow is infinite. Level 18's Arrow of Death laughs in the face of the assassin because it's just better than Assassinate, albeit 6 levels later. Once per day, for 3 actions, you make a bow strike. If it hits, you already deal 10d10 bonus precision damage. If you critically hit, you're doubling that precision damage, and all your other damage, and the target has to make a fortitude save. Why this is, in my opinion, a little bit better than Assassinate is that if they normal fail, not even crit fail, if they normal fail this saving throw, they're dead. They're gone. It still has the incapacitation trait, so it'll only work on creatures equal to or lower than your level, but you're level 18. You know, you get it late, but it's damn good. Plus, you don't need to be freaking undetected to use it. And Master Eldritch Archer spellcasting, blah, 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 blah. This is its own class. Similar to the Beastmaster and the Dragon Disciple, you plan to take this archetype from level 1. Even if you're not the kind of person who plans out their character levels ahead of time, you don't just decide at level 10, I guess I'll dabble in Eldritch Archer. From level 1, you're like, I'm gonna take Eldritch Archer, I'm gonna make sure I have my proficiency set up, I'm gonna take that the second I can. Though honestly, just the Eldritch Shot activity is so worth just taking the dedication. If you happen to be a wizard who is an expert in bows somehow, just taking Eldritch Shot is such a cool idea. You don't even have to take anything else from the archetype. And even if you're a martial class that doesn't rely on spellcasting, you can still take this dedication. You don't have to be able to cast spells to dip into the Eldritch Archer. And things like Seeker Arrow, Phase Arrow, Enchanting Arrow, they're fantastic options for a strictly martial character. If you're a bow-oriented ranger who is pretty much stuck to non-magical damage, just dipping 1 or 2 levels into Eldritch Archer will give you that versatility where you can add some mental damage or add some fire damage from a cantrip. It's so cool. I'm only saddened that there's no way to fire Magic Missile as an arrow, because Magic Missile does not require a spell attack roll, and thus does not work with Eldritch Shot. The Familiar Master. The dedication is super simple. If you don't have a familiar, you get a familiar. If you already have a familiar, your familiar gains an extra ability per day. Meh. Familiar Mascot's a little bit cooler. You can give one of your master abilities on your familiar to an ally instead of yourself. So if you're a high-level spellcaster and one of your allies is a high-level spellcaster, and your familiar has the Spell Battery master ability, you can give that to your ally instead of yourself. So your ally can use your familiar to recharge a spell slot. It's kind of cool. It adds some nice, cool interaction with other characters and your familiar, which doesn't really happen otherwise. Familiar Conduit's super simple. Anytime you cast a spell with a range, you can have that range start from your familiar, which means if you have a flying familiar, that's really good. Fly up 50 feet in the air, shoot a fireball down at an angle or around a corner. It's great stuff. Improved Familiar reduces the required abilities to take a specific familiar by 2. For example, if you wanted to take the Imp Familiar, you would have to be able to have a familiar with up to 8 unique abilities. So if you take Improved Familiar, that number goes down to 6. That's all it does. Mutable Familiar. You spend 10 minutes to swap out one of these familiar abilities for another one of these familiar abilities. Only the ones in the list on this feat can be switched out and switched in, and if one of those abilities is required for your familiar, such as a mole familiar requiring burrower, you can't switch that out. And Incredible Familiar grants your familiar 6 abilities per day instead of 4. So my final thoughts on the Familiar Master is that I'm honestly kinda disappointed. I was hoping for the ability to have multiple familiars at the same time. Like, probably less abilities on each familiar, but still, it'd be so cool. I liked the idea of something similar to the Beastmaster, just for familiars. I wanted to have my own little menagerie. I imagine a Snow White character, maybe a druid, with a frog, and a dove, and a squirrel, and a rabbit, and a cat just hanging around at all times, and they all do, like, one thing. Or maybe they just all talk. Maybe it would have been difficult to balance because of the whole familiar ability, master ability system, but I don't know. I feel like this archetype doesn't give you much. The ability to swap out physical familiar abilities is super niche, and aside from maybe climbing or flying, doesn't sound like it'd come in useful that often. Familiar Mascot and Familiar Conduit aren't too bad. Being able to give allies your master abilities and being able to cast spells from your familiar are really, really good. But you still have to invest in the archetype in the first place in order to get those. And, I don't know, sacrificing 2 feats to gain a familiar and cast spells out of it is not great. And if you're a character that already has a familiar, you're spending a full class feat to grant your familiar 1 extra ability per day with the dedication. Also, I don't really like Improved Familiar. The feat allows you to gain a more powerful familiar, effectively, because it reduces the prerequisites. But that means you would have to ditch your current familiar, because it's not like the Beastmaster, you can switch them out. The rules state you can only have 1 familiar at a time. So if I want that Spell Slime, I have to kick my cat familiar out of my life and get the new Spell Slime one. And at level 6, I don't want to give up. That's probably like 10 plus sessions, probably more than 10 sessions of a game I've spent with that familiar, assuming it didn't die. So I don't just want to be like, cool, see ya, now I have slime. The Gladiator dedication requires impressive performance as a prerequisite, which is really easy to get. You just need trained in performance, and you become trained in gladiatorial lore. Along with this comes a very weird system. If you have spectators, when you're in a combat encounter, you gain temporary hit points equal to your character level for 1 minute. Along with that, you can roll performance for initiative, which is great if you have high charisma but low wisdom. Now, I need to point out, spectators is a sort of loose term the APG just kind of slides in. It defines a spectator as any sentient humanoid creature watching your encounter that is not affiliated with either side. So if you're in a bar, and you're in a bar fight against someone, and all the other patrons are cheering you on, you have spectators. If you're fighting a wolf in the woods and you're surrounded by curious critters watching you, that does not count as spectators because they're not sentient humanoids. It's weird, and it does say GM has final say on what counts as a spectator, but it's a little weird. Fancy moves at level 4. You can use performance to intimidate, which is already a charisma skill. I guess if you're not trained in intimidation, this is fine. Especially since it's a skill feat. You don't have to spend a class feat on it, but I feel like a lot of charisma-based characters come with intimidation. Play to the crowd. Whenever you drop an enemy to 0 hit points while you have spectators, you can use your reaction to make a performance check. If you succeed this check, you get to pick one of a list of 3 benefits, and if you critically succeed, you get to pick 2 benefits. These benefits are +1 armor class until the end of your next turn, +1 to your next attack roll before the end of your next turn, or Temporary hit points equal to your character level for 1 minute. Not bad choices, but do remember that temporary hit points do not stack. You can only have them from one source at a time. So if you still have your temporary hit points from the beginning of the fight thanks to the dedication, even if you pick these temporary hit points from Play to the Crowd, they will replace your old temporary hit points, or you can choose not to replace them and ignore these ones. Stage fighting. This one's basically the same as the Bounty Hunter, where you don't take -2 to non-lethal damage when using weapons without the non-lethal trait. Because I guess being good at stage fighting makes you good at pulling punches, I think is how it rationalizes it. Performative weapons training. You become trained with the bow staff, dueling cape, spiked chain, sword cane, and whip. And whenever your proficiency with any other weapon goes up, these go up too. It's a cool variety of weapons that really you don't find elsewhere. Things like the dueling cape are really hard to get proficiency for, so kinda cool. I like it. Call your shot. This specifically upgrades Play to the Crowd and adds one more benefit for when you succeed. Any creature within 30 feet of you can become Frightened 1. You know, just like the level 1 Ruffian Rogue feat. Except this is at level 8. And that's all this archetype gives. No additional feats, nothing beyond level 8. Just some performance combat support, and a bit of survivability while you have spectators. I guess you can also knock people unconscious easier. It's really difficult to justify this archetype unless you're in a campaign where your encounters will be being watched, since half of these benefits only work if you have spectators. A couple of them are fine. Performative weapons and fancy moves don't need spectators, but the real meat of the archetype comes from Play to the Crowd and the dedication. And I'll be honest, I can't tell you how often my encounters have spectators, at least as a GM. Again, if you were a GM and your player had this archetype, you could make it happen more often so that they don't waste the archetype. But it's just a very, very niche archetype that, you know, if your adventure is in the woods or in a dungeon or in an enemy encampment or anywhere besides a place with other neutral humans, it's pretty worthless. Now, the Herbalist dedication, requiring Trained in Nature and the Natural Medicine skill feat. This dedication grants you infused reagents equal to your character level, just like an alchemist. However, if you do your daily preparations not in the wild, you only get half of your level in infused reagents. These reagents are also limited in that they can only be used to make herbal items. What this means is any item with the healing trait, as well as the antidote and anti-plague alchemical items. Now, the big difference between an alchemist and an herbalist is the herbalist's advanced alchemy level does not increase on its own. It stays at level 1 until you take another feat from this archetype that we'll talk about later on. This means that until you take that other feat, you can only make level 1 or lower healing items. Also, when you take this dedication, you become an expert in the nature skill, and you can use nature instead of crafting if you're specifically making herbal alchemical items. You also don't need alchemist tools to make them, you can use healer's tools instead. Fresh ingredients. If you use your natural medicine skill to treat wounds, you can actually spend a batch of infused reagents to give yourself a +2 to that check. If you're doing this in the wilderness, that bonus actually increases to a +4. Poultice preparation is really interesting. Any of your alchemical items can now be made into a poultice instead of an elixir. For those of you who are unaware, a poultice is sort of like a heavy bandage with like a cream or ointment inside, so that when you slap it on, the ointment absorbs into the skin. So these items you make actually lose the elixir and ingested traits and gain the oil trait. The poultice can be applied with one hand, and because it doesn't need to be ingested, that means even a sickened character can use it. It applies the normal effects of whatever item you actually made, like a healing potion or an antidote, but the recipient also gets to instantly make a check to remove any persistent acid, bleeding, or fire damage. Endemic herbs. When you're making your daily preparations, For each item you make, you can spend an additional batch of ingredients to give it a bonus according to where you prepared it. If you want to read, I'm not going to go through this whole list, but you can pause, check out the list over there. All of these benefits last for 1 minute unless they state otherwise. And finally, capping out at level 6, I think the lowest level an archetype is capped out so far is Expert Herbalism. Your advanced alchemy level skyrockets up to your level -3. Which means if you take this at level 6, it jumps from level 1 to level 3. But if you take this later on at, say, level 10, your advanced alchemy jumps from level 1 to level 7. You also, from then on, automatically gain all formulas for elixirs of life the second your advanced alchemy level is high enough to make them. This is a phenomenal support archetype. For as little as 2 feats, you can gain access to so many healing items every single day. Even if you just take the dedication, you get free healing potions. Even if you're just level 3, so long as you have the formula, you get 3 healing potions every day. Future note out here, jumping in really quick. Everything I say about the Herbalist here is doubled in efficiency because the Herbalist's infused reagents function just like an alchemist in that every batch you spend makes 2 items. So at level 3, you would actually get 6 healing potions. This is absolutely nuts. Okay, back to me. And each of those potions restores 1d6 hit points. And then right when you hit level 6, you can take Expert Herbalism and create 6 lesser healing potions per day, which each heal for 3d6 plus 6. I could honestly see this archetype being something that people dip into if they have nothing better to do, similar to how everyone takes battle medicine. The ability to just create healing items out of thin air without spending any money or resources is so powerful. This is probably one of the strongest archetypes we've seen so far. And that is all the time I have for today. Some really, really impressive archetypes and some really, really not impressive archetypes. But what do you think? Are there any crazy combos that could make the Gladiator or the Duelist incredibly powerful? Are the Eldritch Archer and Herbalist less good than I give them credit for? Am I over-exaggerating them? Tell me your thoughts down in the comments. I read every single one of them, and I try my best to answer as many as I can. If you enjoyed my content, please consider leaving a like to give me a bump in the YouTube algorithm. It keeps them happy. Plus, think about subscribing and ring the bell to know exactly when the next video goes live. I want to give a huge shout out to Quid Thulu, Troy Hughes, Paul Rand, and Carestia, as well as the rest of my phenomenal patrons. And by the time I upload this, I don't know if there will be any, but if there are, thank you to our new YouTube members. You can see that join button down in the description. If you want to support the channel, that is a phenomenal way to do it. There's tons of different tiers with tons of different perks. There's a bunch of links in the description to my Patreon, where you can also pledge to support the channel, our Discord, which is a thriving RPG community that loves to hang out, talk about RPGs, movies, video games, whatever. There's also a link to my Twitter, where I sometimes say stupid stuff and do giveaways. There's one going on right now, I'm just saying. And finally, there's a link to my Ko-fi, where if you ever just wanted to make a one-time small donation, it's a great place to do so. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And until next time, no nat ones.